Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. Today we're going to be discussing the case of a man who had complete control over 4 other people. He ordered 3 of his followers to inflict the most sadistic, barbaric, torturous acts on a vulnerable, innocent man, resulting in one of the most horrific murders. This is a case that contains many graphic details that are really hard to hear, but were things that this man was forced to endure. This is the torture and murder of James Prout, the case of the North Shields death cult. James Prout, who went by the nickname Jimmy, was born in Newcastle in 1970. He was the second youngest of 8 children. Jimmy's mother really struggled with her mental health and he had no relationship with his father. His father was never present, he was never in Jimmy's life. As you can imagine, this meant that things weren't easy for the Prout family. A single mother left to raise 8 children all by herself while struggling with her mental health and living in a flat. Jimmy's older brother Edward, who went by Eddie, spoke about their upbringing and he said, quote, "We were brought up by our mother in Noble Street flats. We have 4 brothers and 3 sisters. It was a struggle for my mum to keep us all together as our father was never around when we were younger. At the age of 11 or 12, I turned to a life of crime and ended up in care. I never hurt anyone. I just wanted to make sure that we all had a meal and a roof over our head. We only done it to survive." Little brother Jimmy would follow in Eddie's footsteps, also trying to help support his family by committing petty crime, and he too would end up in the care system. He was actually moved to a home or a school down in Wales. He would remain in Wales until he was 16 years old, but eventually made his way back up north. When he arrived back home though, it was clear that he had changed. He wasn't the same happy-go-lucky, jolly Jimmy that had left. Eddie believed that his younger brother had suffered from some sort of abuse while in Wales, maybe even sexual abuse. Jimmy was a very vulnerable person. He obviously didn't have the ideal upbringing, he had learning difficulties, and he was illiterate. He really struggled with his reading and writing. Despite these hurdles, however, Jimmy went on to make a really nice life for himself. He was very well liked by everyone who knew him. He was cheery, he was pleasant, helpful, and said to have had a heart of gold. He was a Newcastle supporter. He looked after himself and his appearance. He always wanted to look nice, clean, and presentable. He struggled with his literacy, but one thing about Jimmy was that he was really good with his hands when it came to fixing things, and he worked within a scrapyard for some time. He got into a relationship with a woman named Mandy, who he had met on a night out, and she described Jimmy as, quote, "daft as a brush, a joker, and a laugh." They soon became a little family, the couple going on to have 2 children together. However, in 2006, things began to rapidly change. Jimmy had started using cannabis. He had started getting into trouble with the police, and Mandy could only tolerate it and back him for so long before she ended their relationship after 14 years together. And seemingly everything in Jimmy's life went crashing down with it. He had lost his partner, he no longer saw his children, and he ended up on the streets, homeless. He would frequently go to the People's Kitchen, which was a soup kitchen in Newcastle city centre, a non-profit helping the vulnerable and the homeless community. While here, he would meet and become friendly with one of the volunteers named Zahid Zaman. Zahid was a wheelchair user who moved to North Shields from Sheffield in around 2007. He was restricted to his wheelchair after getting into an almost fatal car accident. He was considered a pillar of the community. Everyone who knew Zahid loved him. He was selfless and did anything for anyone. He spent a lot of his free time doing volunteering work. He attended many charity events alongside Newcastle's mayor because of the sheer amount of charity work that he did. This was something that he was very devoted to. One notable incident about Zahid that got him a lot of praise was when he used his home CCTV cameras to help find a missing dog and return the dog to its owner. There was a cash prize for the return of the dog, but Zahid declined the reward money. He said that the owner's happiness was enough for him. He loved animals and was just happy to reunite the dog with its owner. He was a delightful neighbour to some, the type of man who would stop and speak to you in the street. He was very approachable, chatty and friendly. In general, Zahid Zaman appeared to be a good, generous, caring, kind, helpful man. All of that, however, was a facade. For starters, Zahid didn't even need to use a wheelchair, not even like he only needed it sometimes for assistance. He just flat out did not need it. He was a prolific liar and you couldn't trust a single thing that came out of his mouth. It's unknown if he ever was actually in a fatal car accident or if that was just a story. He only lied about being in the wheelchair so that he could claim disability benefits. Some people were aware that he didn't need to use it either. He could be seen walking up and down the street casually. He was seen lugging heavy furniture into a house, carrying it while walking. He was seen jumping out of the wheelchair to run to catch a bus. And if he got into an argument with someone, he would just stand up out of his chair and start squaring up to them, wanting to get into a fist fight. Getting into altercations was a semi-regular thing for Zahid. He was actually really argumentative. For a very long time, he successfully managed to maintain the appearance of being that kind, friendly, lovely man, when in reality he was anything but. He managed to pull the wool over many people's eyes, but not everyone. Zahid had moved from Sheffield to North Shields in order to move in with Kay Rayworth, his girlfriend who he had met online. He moved into her bought home at 35 St. Stephen's Way. Kay was a very active and social member of her community, described as cheerful. She worked as a carer, she sang in the church choir, and she too did her bit of volunteering. Kay was a mother of two who had twice been married. However, in 2004, her second marriage broke down, and this had a really negative impact on Kay's mental health. She would self-medicate with alcohol. Like so many people do when they're looking for new connections, Kay decided to sign up to a dating app, and that's where she met Zahid, who she became completely enamored by. He swooped her off her feet, he love-bombed her, and despite it being so early on in their relationship, when Zahid suggested that he move in with her, she said yes immediately. Shortly after his arrival to North Shields though, Zahid began to quickly take over Kay's entire life. Slowly but surely, bit by bit, he chipped away at her self-worth and managed to get complete control over Kay. He started dictating who could come to her house. This resulted in her own adult children being forbidden from visiting. He dictated who Kay was allowed to see, to speak to, where she was allowed to go, and what she was allowed to do. Before she knew it, Zahid had completely isolated her and she had no one to confide in about the abuse that she was enduring. Zahid would fly into fits of rage over the most minute things. He would pick up a hammer and smash holes into the wall while threatening Kay, saying that he was going to strike her next. He would physically beat her, he would degrade her, he would even spit on her, and he genuinely terrified her. Zahid made Kay believe that he was really high up in some sort of gang, that he had to wear a bulletproof vest for his protection, and that he was a dangerous wanted man who knew people, so Kay better not cross him. Whenever he did kick off, which was often, he had a way of always twisting the narrative to make it Kay's fault. It was her fault that he got so angry. It was her fault that he reacted the way that he did. Not like he is a fully grown man who should be able to handle his own emotions. Just total gaslighting, manipulation, emotional and physical abuse. People who were around Kay, I gather this is when she was at work and stuff, said that she wasn't her usual bubbly, outgoing self. herself. She had become very reserved and isolated. Zahid became the neighbour from hell on St. Stephen's Way. He was a proper little grass. He would wait for the neighbours to do the slightest thing and then ring the police on them to try and get them in trouble simply for his own enjoyment. He would do things to purposefully rile them up, like accidentally knocking their bins over with his wheelchair, meaning that there was rubbish all over. He would bang on the walls all hours of the night so that they couldn't sleep, and on one occasion he either threatened or fully followed through with setting a neighbour's shed on fire. On another occasion, he actually assaulted one of the neighbours, putting a snooker ball inside of a sock and whacking the neighbour with it after an argument. He would go about wearing a camera on himself, and if anyone watches them walking videos on YouTube, I love watching walking around Amsterdam and the Lake Districts and stuff. That's exactly the type of camera that I imagine that he was wearing. He would wear this to try and catch people arguing with them. He'd bait them, hoping to capture something, just so that he could report them to the police for harassment. The CCTV camera that I mentioned earlier, which he used to help track down that missing dog, was only put up so that he could spy on people. And while we're on the topic of that dog, some people believed that it was actually Zahid who kidnapped it. He wanted the attention and the praise of returning the dog back, so he was the one who kidnapped it. If anyone spoke up about what Zahid was doing, he would accuse them of being racist or discriminatory against him. And again, for many people, he had the reputation of being such a lovely, innocent man, so to hear that he was allegedly doing all of this was simply unbelievable to some people. But Zahid Zaman was capable of doing all that. In fact, he was capable of going even further and doing the unthinkable. Zahid would, and I'm going to use the word recruit here, recruit more people into whatever he was doing. He wanted more people under his wing who he could control. He met a woman named Myra Wood through Facebook, and very similarly to what happened with Kay, they began dating online. Zahid loved Bomda and got Myra under his spell, doing whatever he wanted, no questions asked. So Zahid is in a relationship with both Kay and Myra, but I don't think the women were in a relationship together, so I don't know if that makes it a polygamous relationship or not. Anne Corbett would be brought into the picture after meeting Zahid while he was volunteering at the People's Kitchen. She was more susceptible to Zahid's manipulation. Anne had a learning disability, she was experiencing homelessness, and was quite a bit younger than everyone else. She was in her early 20s, and Kay, Myra and Zahid were all over 40, so there's a bit of power imbalance there as well. Now, not everyone could live inside of number 35 St. Stephen's Way. They wouldn't all fit comfortably, and so Myra and Anne were sent around the corner to number 75, which was another house that was owned by Kay. While at the People's Kitchen, Anne would meet Jimmy Prout, and the two took a liking to each other, striking up conversations, and eventually they ended up dating. With Zahid's permission, Jimmy was allowed to move into number 75. Remember, at this point in time, Jimmy is also homeless, and Zahid knew him from the People's Kitchen. Zahid wanted to isolate everyone from the outside world and limit what the outside world could see of them. Across both of the houses, he stuck up cardboard and newspaper covering the windows so that no one could see in or out. Which, isn't that ironic? He doesn't want people seeing what he's doing, yet he has the CCTV cameras fitted to literally spy on his neighbours. The group of five, Jimmy, Zahid, Kay, Anne and Myra, formed an almost cult-like gang, and this is part of the reason that they were dubbed the North Shields Death Cult by the media. They weren't really focused on a religion like other cults can be, but they did have many cult-like qualities, including the leader dictating how the others should think, act and feel. In this case, Zahid is very much the leader. They all had to share the same opinions as Zahid, and they weren't allowed to challenge him or disagree with something that he was saying. The followers display unquestioning commitment to their leader, The members are isolated. In this case, Zahid is either living with one of them or in control of where the others live, which happens to be within arm's reach. The followers are controlled and exploited, and there's very much an us versus them situation going on. If you weren't part of their circle, they didn't want to associate with you. Zahid purposely scoped out vulnerable individuals in order to manipulate them into doing what he wanted. That's likely why he took up volunteering at the soup kitchen. He's scoping out. He's on the prowl. There was a hierarchy within the group. Zahid was very much at the top. He was better than all of them. He was the commander. He was the leader. What he said went. He was better than all of them. The women were all relatively equal. Kate and Myra were just slightly above Anne because they were Zahid's girlfriends, and Jimmy was right at the bottom. Jimmy had become a skivvy and basically a slave for the group. He would do all of the domestic stuff across both houses, such as cooking, cleaning, gardening, odd jobs around the house, and he had no power or say in anything whatsoever. He was expected to do whatever Zahid wanted and follow him blindly. If Jimmy's cleaning or cooking or what have you weren't up to the impossible high standards of Zahid, Jimmy would be punished with verbal and or physical abuse, shouting or screaming matches or slaps and punches. Neighbours would later recall being able to hear some of the shouting, and they sometimes saw Jimmy with bruises. Just because Zahid was being abusive towards Jimmy, it didn't mean that it stopped it for any of the women. He continued to be his normal violent self and would often beat the women mercilessly and subjected them to degradation. Alongside the brutal beatings, Zahid would be threatening. We already know that because he would often threaten Kay with a hammer, but it wouldn't be uncommon for a knife to be held at one of their throats. He would demand almost constant sex from the women and expected his girlfriends to participate in his sexual fantasies. They would drink his urine on demand, and he tried to force them to act out on one of his sick kinks. Now, I don't like to kink shame anyone. I think as long as you're not hurting anyone, everyone's consenting and everything is legal, then, do whatever you want. But this is something else. Zahid had a bestiality kink, and he would watch explicit videos involving women, sex, and dogs. He wanted Kay and Myra involved in this, so he physically went out and bought a dog for this very purpose. He tried to force Kay to have sex with the dog, but that's where they drew the line. That was not going to happen. That was never going to happen. Obviously, what's happening to the women is horrifying. Zahid is the epitome of an evil man. No one should ever have to be forced into doing what they were or enduring what they were, but that didn't make them any more sympathetic towards Jimmy. If anything, they took their frustrations with Zahid out on Jimmy, who didn't do anything wrong. He would become their punching bag. As part of some of his punishments, food was withheld from Jimmy and he quickly dropped a significant amount of weight, which naturally made him weaker too. He wasn't getting energy or nutrients from food that we need to survive and to function. And so as that continued and it progressed, it became harder for him to even try and defend himself or to leave or even to keep up with all of the domestic stuff that he was supposed to, which had the knock-on effect. Because he was so weak, he wasn't able to do things as well as he used to, he wasn't able to keep up as much, and that made Zahid not very happy, which resulted in even more punishments for Jimmy. Whatever he done was never right, and this was just an impossible cycle. For a brief time in 2015, Anne's brother, who was named Ivan, lived at number 75 with Anne, Myra and Jimmy, much to the disapproval of Zahid, who eventually kicked him out because he couldn't recruit Ivan. Ivan couldn't be manipulated by him. He wasn't going to follow orders blindly. After he left, Zahid apparently realised that Ivan had stolen some things from the house, including some of his tools, and taken them with him. Whether this actually happened is anyone's guess, because again, Zahid is such a liar, you can't keep up with everything that he's saying. But the group took him at face value and believed him, and to them, there was only one person to blame for this. It wasn't Ivan for allegedly stealing from them, it was Jimmy. Jimmy allowed Ivan to steal from them. He didn't watch Ivan well enough. He didn't keep his eyes on their stuff properly. And for this, he was going to be punished. On the 27th of November 2015, Jimmy arrived at North Tyneside Hospital with Zahid after being mercilessly beaten and stabbed. The doctors were told that he had been caught, kicked, punched, and hit with a baseball bat or similar. Zahid actually did most of the talking throughout the appointment, and it apparently crossed no one's mind to get Jimmy alone to speak to him without this very overbearing person next to him. Jimmy had bruising to his arms, leg, head, face, and back, along with stab wounds to his upper left arm and shoulder. His shoulder was actually fractured, showing just how much force went into this beating and stabbing. I couldn't find if any reports or anything were taken from the hospital, but gathering on what Eddie would later say, it seemed like the hospital did nothing. This was only one of many times that Jimmy went for medical help because of his injuries, and if anyone thought to just pay that tiny bit more attention, maybe we wouldn't be here today. And it wasn't like Jimmy was even concealing what was happening to him. Not really. In his own way, he had cried out for help. Jimmy would post pictures on Facebook showing his body, showing his injuries, the result of months and months of abuse, but sadly was ignored. The pictures are out there to see, and they're very distressing, heartbreaking, and just unbelievable. They're really, really hard to look at. They show Jimmy in an almost skeletal state. One picture shows his whole side black and blue with extensive bruises. They show his mouth with teeth missing. During one punishment, using either a pair of pliers and a chisel and hammer, Jimmy's teeth were knocked or pulled out. This was another time where he had went for medical help, and Zahid told the doctor that Jimmy had pulled his teeth out himself. Other pictures that Jimmy uploaded shows cuts to his nose, forehead, and him with 2 black eyes. He posted these harrowing pictures to his account with captions such as, quote, "My mouth hurts, my body hurts, and my shoulder hurts." I can't imagine how much courage that must have taken Jimmy to post these photos. He knew what the repercussions of this could have been, but still, this was his way of crying out and asking for help. But sadly, none came. I also really want to know who took these photos, because was it Anne, his apparent girlfriend? I'm sure if it was, him wanting these pictures would have raised some questions. But if it was someone who was outside of the group, how did they not get him more help? They could see the state that he was in. What had been happening to Jimmy for months at this point is already horrific. Starvation, stabbing, being used as a slave, beaten, isolation, and all of the rest. But what was about to come is nothing short of monstrous, barbaric, and sadistic. Over the next few months, the brutal treatment of Jimmy Prout at the hands of Zahid, Kay, Myra, and Anne escalated to literal torture. Jimmy, who was incredibly weak thanks to months and months of starvation, would have a Jack Daniels bottle smashed over his head, and as I remember, they are really thick, heavy things. The group would take turns hitting, kicking, punching, stamping on, strangling Jimmy. The women are eagerly participating in this. Zahid, having that bestiality fetish, forced Jimmy to rape his dog, which Zahid would have just found absolutely amazing. Probably one of the most depraved, degrading, sickening things that the group done to Jimmy was when he was restrained. He had his scrotum sliced open using a Stanley knife and had one of his testicles removed. Zahid actually asked Jimmy which testicle he wanted them to cut out, and how do you even answer that question? Using the Stanley knife, again, his scrotum was sliced open, one of his testicles was removed, and Zahid literally took it into the kitchen, boiled it in some water, and then forced Jimmy to eat it. To eat his own testicle. That is probably one of the most disturbing things that I have ever heard of. The pain that Jimmy would have gone through in that moment and his screaming, I just can't get it out of my head, because surely he must have screamed out in pain so much. I can't understand how no one would have heard that and no one called the police. And just the fact that these 4 other people are relishing in doing this knocks me absolutely sick. The slice wound to Jimmy's scrotum was cauterized, aka burnt, to be closed. How he managed to hold on to his life through all of this, I really do not know. On the CCTV cameras that Zahid had installed on number 35 St. Stephen's Way, you can see Jimmy's deterioration. Over the weeks and months, you can see him starting off looking relatively well, being able to walk and support himself, but as time goes on, you can see where he begins to need help walking. He's being pushed to stay upright and shoved to actually walk. Eventually, as the time goes on, the CCTV captured the weakening of Jimmy. He's starting to struggle to stay afoot. He's stumbling and falling into fences. He's clinging on the woman to help keep himself from falling. On one of the final CCTV clips, you can see everyone leaving number 35 in the middle of the night. And at one point, not too far away from the house, Jimmy physically collapses, dropping to the floor, and is hoisted up, needing to be dragged along to presumably number 75, where most of the torture took place. I find it impossible to believe that no one saw the state that Jimmy was in when he was like this. There's no way that they were able to walk around in broad daylight like this the whole time and no one seeing them, which they were. They were walking about during the day with Jimmy in this condition. But if people did see him, maybe that's where the bystander effect comes into play. The bystander effect is a social psychological theory that states that individuals are less likely to offer a victim help in presence of other people. Sometimes when there's a lot of people that are witnessing something, a person might feel that they don't want to get involved and they will just automatically assume that surely someone else is going to get involved, surely someone else is going to help, someone else is going to call the police. But that doesn't always happen. One of the most infamous cases of the bystander effect being the murder of Kitty Genovese. In the early hours of the 9th of February 2016, Zahid Zaman receives a text message from Myra at 5:09 AM saying, quote, "That bastard has kept me awake all fucking night." Zahid and Kay leave number 35 and head over to number 75 to shut Jimmy up, to try and come up with a way to silence him. He is probably lay crying out in excruciating pain. It was later determined at the trial that it was Anne who created a makeshift gag with some trousers, tying them around Jimmy's mouth in an effort to try and muffle his cries and his screams. Only, maybe probably unbeknownst to her, the trousers covered both Jimmy's mouth and nose, meaning that he could not breathe and would suffocate to death. It was around about an hour later, Zahid and Kay had already left, that one of the women went to check on a now silent Jimmy and realised that he was dead. Shortly after the discovery, Zahid and Kay were once again spotted on the CCTV camera, leaving number 35, pushing a spare wheelchair, heading towards number 75. When they arrived, everyone aided in dressing Jimmy's body, then wrapping him up in a sleeping bag. I don't know if he was maybe in pyjamas before, or if he was half dressed, or even if he was naked. The group then used the spare wheelchair to wheel Jimmy to what was described as some wasteland nearby. It was just under 100 metres away from the house, and there they left Jimmy Prout's body. That evening, Zahid, Kay, Myra and Anne all lit a bonfire, probably trying to incinerate as much evidence as they could. Over the next few days, the group began to put on a really elaborate performance to their neighbours, asking if they had seen Jimmy, claiming that they were worried for him, they hadn't seen him or heard from him in a couple of days. When, in actuality, They had no feelings of guilt or remorse. If they did, they would have called an ambulance for help and not literally left Jimmy's body out in some wasteland. This was further proven when one of them, either Zahid, Kay, Myra or Anne, went back to Jimmy's body a couple of days later to get his bank card so that they could steal money from him. They reached their hands into the pocket of a dead man, and even after stealing his life, that still wasn't enough. They needed to steal just that bit more. But this facade, this performance didn't hold on for long. Towards the end of May, the group began to experience some paranoia about getting found out. At this point, it's been around about 5 weeks and Jimmy's body was still sadly undiscovered, and I don't know if anyone was really looking for him. It's unclear whether he was reported missing, but if he was, the search efforts to find him were pretty much non-existent, which you often hear when it comes to cases where people don't live the quote-unquote typical lifestyle. Jimmy was a man who was known to the police. He had a history of drug abuse. He had lived a quote-unquote chaotic lifestyle, and so maybe his disappearance wasn't a priority to the police. Zahid, Kay and Myra believed that Anne was going to go to the police. She really wasn't dealing with what had happened and the guilt was eating her up inside. I guess that she must have expressed to at least one of them that she wanted to go to the police, and after expressing this, something must have happened because Anne went on the run. She disappeared. Knowing that she is likely going to talk, Zahid decided he wanted to control the narrative, so he was going to get there first. On the 25th of March, Zahid Zaman rang the police sounding extremely distressed, telling the operator that Anne Corbett had attempted to attack him using a hammer, which is something that Kay corroborated. He said that Anne confessed to him that she had murdered one of their other friends, a man named Jimmy Prout, and that she was going to murder them too. When the police officers arrived at number 35 St. Stephen's Way, Zahid presented the officers with 3 bits of paper, which he said that Anne had dropped during the altercation of trying to attack him. And what happened to be written on the paper? A full confession to Jimmy's murder, supposedly written by Anne and signed with her name at the bottom. Zahid must have thought that the officers were born yesterday, thinking that they were going to fall for this, but thankfully they didn't, and they arrested Zahid, Kay and Myra. This was probably one of the first times that Zahid's manipulation didn't work. Anne was eventually tracked down and she would be arrested 2 days later on the 27th of March. During their questioning, everyone done their best to try and deflect blame, and so they began to point the finger at each other. Their stories would constantly change and be inconsistent. They changed their story based off the evidence that they were presented with in order to try and minimise their own participation. Because of this, it was actually really difficult to determine who had done what. On the day of her arrest, however, Anne fully confessed to the police everything that had happened, and she guided them to where they could find Jimmy. His body was found on the wasteland at around 3:30 p.m, where he had been lay for 6-ish weeks. Jimmy's body was badly decomposed and had partly been eaten by animals. Due to this, his cause of death was unable to be determined. What was still present was the evidence of his barbaric torture. Wounds, stabs, abrasions to his skin, missing teeth, malnourishment, a missing testicle, and so much more. It was like nothing any of the detectives had ever seen. Their trial began at Newcastle Crown Court in May 2017. The court described the extent of Jimmy's torture by comparing it to something from the Dark Ages. During trial, Zahid claimed that the only thing he ever did to Jimmy was slap him and that most of the abuse came from the women. He relayed a story onto the court where he claimed that Anne had once used a piece of wood to beat Jimmy up after Jimmy was accused of spreading rumours about her and the group. Zahid Zaman, as the ringleader of the cult, was found guilty of murder and handed a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum of 33 years to serve. As it was determined that it was Anne who tied the trousers around Jimmy's face, which resulted in him suffocating to death, she was also found guilty of murder and was handed a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum of 27 years to serve. Both Kate and Myra were found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a vulnerable adult. Kate was handed a sentence of 12 years imprisonment and Myra was given only 9. Eddie, who again is Jimmy's older brother, is extremely vocal on how he believes that Jimmy was let down by the services who were meant to help him. It came out that there were over 17 instances where intervention could have saved Jimmy's life. Several trips to the hospital, A&E, the GP, and so much more. Eddie believes that Jimmy didn't get the help that he so desperately needed because he had been in trouble in the past and was branded as a criminal. He has very much been a loud and prominent voice for Jimmy and has been fighting to try and get him justice. He doesn't want his brother to be forgotten. He has since said that he's begun to feel some sort of sympathy towards Anne due to the amount of true regret and remorse that she is apparently showing. He said, quote, "In a way, I now feel sorry for Anne Corbett. I have got a little bit of sympathy for her because the person that interviewed her at the prison said she was full of remorse. She says that she wants to die in prison. She even said that she would like to say sorry, and if she could have prevented it, she would have. She is the only one that has shown any kind of remorse. It does bring me a little bit of comfort, and I do feel a bit sorry for her." Eddie showing more care to one of his brother's murderers than they ever did to Jimmy Prout. Thank you again for joining me for today's episode. Please don't forget to follow the podcast so that you never miss a new upload. You can find photos and updates over on the Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn. I appreciate you for being here and I'll catch you all on the next one.